All right, sorry I'm a minute or so late. We're going to continue today with the example we went over last time. And I hope to go over several things associated with that. Let's look where we left off, where I remember we left off. I'm going to take these and copy these files over to my web server's root, which is CINET pub www root. Now, your mileage may vary. If you are running XAMPP, you will have a different location to move your files to. I would hope everyone has XAMPP installed. And can at least do basic PHP. All right, with this example we looked at last time, let's spend a minute to review it. Again, I have to request the files from my local server, so I type in localhost. I can't simply do like I did with basic HTML files and just double click them and bring them on. All right, type in localhost, I get this. And I think this time we worked on this, we worked on the calculator. Whereas you enter an age and you enter how many beats per 6 seconds, say 20, and you calculate, and this tells me that the person is above the optimal heart range. All right. We did this through a variety of functions. And if we look, we have in this include file, we have a list of functions that are used. And we want to observe a few things about these functions, because I'm telling you that these are good functions, but I think we need to understand why they are good functions. All right, let's cover why these are good functions and what the impact of having good functions as opposed to just any old functions is. In other words, why are these good and what benefit do we get for having these functions that are, quote, good? First of all, each function does one thing. This one calculates a maximum rate. Straightforward enough, right? If you want to know the absolute maximum heart rate that someone should get at a certain age, call this function. This calculates the minimum of the exercise range heart or maximum, and this one does the minimum. Oh, this one does a minimum and this one does a maximum. I was highlighting the wrong things. This function checks to see if we are in range. That's all it does. It takes some arguments and it does the work and it returns an answer. Yes, it's in range. No, it's not in range. All right. Or actually it returns 3 values. One value, a -1, means it's below range. A value of 1 means it's in range or above the range, and a value of 0 means it's in the range. And that's it. That's these 3 functions. Now, so each one of them does one thing and one thing alone. All right, that's one good thing about them. Second thing is that they are short. Notice that I can see the entire function on the screen without having to vertical scroll. All right. It's difficult something if the function is so big that you have to scroll to see the entire function. It makes it harder to read. Harder to read means harder to maintain, harder to make changes to. So that's the second characteristic. All these functions fit on one page, even though I have the font bigger than you might have the font if you were actually working on this. So I can wrap my head around this because I can wrap my eyes around this and see everything all in one screen. Third thing is I do not repeat myself. When I'm calculating if something is in range, I call the function to get the maximum. I call the function to get the minimum. So it's not like I repeat this formula over here to check to see if it's in range. I define that formula to calculate the minimum exercise heart range in this function. And any place I need to calculate it, I call this function. So I do not repeat ourselves. Remember, DRY, do not repeat yourself. And therefore, this, when it needs to call it, it's ready to do so. Lastly, and this is a really important one, these functions are self-contained. What do I mean by self-contained? It means that all the variables are either used and defined inside the function or they get passed in as arguments. So for example, the age on the one screen in the calculator page, you enter that in a form. And that gets passed to the query on the query string to the second page that does the calculation. So in this page, the value of the age comes from the query string. On this page, we haven't looked at this page yet. I don't think so anyhow, but we'll look at it or relook at it in a minute here. The value comes from a loop. So we get the value for the age that we're going to do the calculation for in two different ways. But this doesn't matter because this is accepting that as an argument. So it's not pulling it from the query string inside the function. Outside of the function, yeah. Outside the function that does that, of course we have to pull it from the query string in order to make it work. But inside the function, it gets passed in as an argument. So everything the function needs is either in the function or passed to it as an argument. And finally, the only way this function communicates with whoever called it is by the return value. So it communicates with the outside world by the argument and by the return value. That's one thing that makes a good function. Now, we have some functions that are tied to the page, that are pulling things from query strings and so on and so forth. That's unavoidable. Those we're not necessarily worried about being, being reusable. For example, this check range function. This check range function, yeah, we're pulling the value from the query string. Yeah, we're pulling the value from the query string in this function. That's okay though, because this function, we don't need to be reusable. This function is written specifically for the form that it's processing. So being able to identify like what functions are generic that you're going to be able to, that you're going to want to call from multiple places, and what functions are tied to the page is important. Generally speaking, the ones that are tied to the page are the boss functions. And the ones that are reusable are the worker functions. The boss functions sort of control the flow of what's being done. The working functions do the actual work. So yeah, in this function to display the output, we grab the value from the age, we grab the number of beats, but we call the actual reusable function and pass it the age and the beats and how many seconds. And then we use that. So this function I'm not so worried about because it's tied to this check range page. It's tied to this page right here. If we're using this on another page, we might validate differently because we might have different form fields. And the output we display might be different. So this is tied to that page. The display output and the validation. All right, so all those things taken together are what to make a good function. And you should consider this for your homework assignment where you have to do the tuition or LC. So let's talk about that for a second. Here is the table that I want you to use for how tuition is calculated. This table right here. So what do you think you're going to need a function for? You're going to need a function to calculate tuition. Now you're going to create a table like I created a table, and you're going to create a calculator similar to the calculator I created. But what is the reusable function going to need? The reusable function is going to need two things to do the calculation. So if you asked me, what is my tuition going to be? I would ask you, well, are you in county, out of county, or out of state? And how many credit hours are you taking? Oh, you're out of county and you're taking 10 credit hours? All right, your tuition is going to be this. Your code's the same way. It needs two pieces of information to do the calculation. It needs to know your residency code, and you could just make up some values, IC for in-county, OC for out-of-county, OS for out-of-state. It needs the residency and the number of credit hours to do the calculation. So you should have a function, calculate tuition, that accepts those two arguments, does the calculation, and returns the answer. If you do that, then your function is going to be reusable because it doesn't accept anything from the outside world other than the arguments. And it doesn't do anything to the outside world other than return a value. On the outside world, I mean the page that it's on. All right. It doesn't display the answer somewhere. It returns a value and let the boss function decide where to display it. Now, how do I want to say this? You need to write it with a reusable function like that. If you just give me correct results, that's not 100% of the points. You won't get full credit for it if you just give me the result and you do not use a reusable function. What do I mean by a reusable function? I mean a function that can be used in other places, that accepts the arguments that I defined and returns the answer. All right, let's look at the chart. I don't recall if we've seen this before or not, but let's take a look at it. So what's the chart do? Well, it has my include file to include my generic functions. Here's a nice thing. The person that wrote this doesn't need to know anything about what the heartbeats are. They just need to know what functions to call. So I have my list of functions. I have my HTML. I have my includes for my header, nav, and footer. I then have a table. And I have a PHP loop. For age equals 20, age less than or equal to 80, increment by 5 years. For loop starts here and ends here. I know that's a little confusing. If you'd rather, you could write this as just one big PHP block and use echoes to output the HTML and the values for age and calculation. So we do this loop. The first column contains the age, so we print out the age in that TD. The second column returns, we get the minimum, we get the maximum, and we output val1 and val2 BPM. This is using what are called PHP magic quotes. Depending on the version of PHP you use, this might not be working. So what you would do instead is concatenate these values like this. You put the variables outside of the quotes. You put the hard-coded strings inside quotes. And you put a dot between the values. The dot is used for concatenation in PHP. And we get the same results. I thought we'd get the same results. What did I do wrong? Got a dot. Remember I talked about before finding your PHP ini file and enable errors. Let's do that here to refresh your memory. Let's search for PHP ini. It's in this folder. Let's open the file location. There it is. Let's open it up. And let's find our errors. Again, if you're using XAMPP, or your PHP ini is going to be in a different location, but you should be able to find it somewhere. What you're going to be looking for is this display errors. It's initially set to off. We're going to want to turn it on. And it even says here, if you are in development mode, have it on. If you're in production mode, have it turned off. The reason for this is we don't want to display errors, PHP errors, if our site is up and running, because those sometimes can be used by hackers to infiltrate the system. They get some knowledge about the system. I'm going to save this. Oh, I fixed the error. Let me screw it up again. And it tells us parse error, syntax error, unexpected variable, $ value. And it tells me the line of code that it's on. So I can go and look at that line and say, oh, it's expecting a concatenation symbol there. It can't do anything with just a variable. So that's the problem. And there, we're back in business. So see what the chart does. It calls the exact same functions as the calculator does. It just gets the data, the input data, from a different place. In this case, it gets the age from, not from the query string, not from a form field, but it gets the value from a counter in a loop. That's okay. This function here doesn't care where we get the age from. We could use a random number for what that's worth and generate the age and call this function. It doesn't care where the value of the age comes from. It's not tied to a specific query string item or a specific variable in the boss program. Whatever the age is, it gets passed in as an argument. Now, all these things I'm describing are true for PHP, but they're true in other programming languages too. All the criteria I gave for writing good functions, it applies, when you're writing them in other languages as well. So I can call it and give it the value from the counter, and this is going to output the range, and finally it's going to output the maximum rate. All right, let's look at the postback, which we looked at it last time, but I think we kind of rushed through it. So let's check it out. Calculator postback. Missing age. I think I only put validation in for age, which, again, you'd want validation for both. Notice how we stay on the same page. That way we see the values for the numbers that we entered in. What this actually does, it actually calls the page a second time. It's called a postback. Notice the first time we call this page, there's nothing on the query string. We enter some data, press submit, the calculate button, and that calls the page again and gives us values on the query string. So we know what mode we're in based on whether there's something on the query string or not. What's on the query string? Well, the values from our form. I don't know what that was about, so I'm not going to save it. I think it's set the way we need it to be now. Look at calculator postback. And let's look at the query string we get. The second time around. All right, we're calling the same page back, calculator postback. But this time there's three things on the query string. TXT age, TXT beats, and button submit. That corresponds to the fields that are in our form. Here's our form. TXT age, TXT beats, and button submit. Let's look at how we accomplish this post back. I have JavaScript here to validate. Of course, I'm only validating the age. If you were doing this for real, you'd also want to validate the heartbeats as too. I think I did this example in the middle of a lecture, and I didn't have the time to go and complete it, but you get the idea. We have our header. We grab these variables, age and beats. We set them equal to nothing. And if they're on the query string, we populate those variables. That's what isSet means. I'm asking, is there anything on the query string for TXT age? If there is, then I populate that age variable. Otherwise, I put a string in it. All right, I have all this. I have my form. The action is call calculator post back. That's the same page. So I'm sending it back to this page. The method is get. So I'm going to put the values on the query string. On submit, I call validate form. This validate form goes and returns either true or false. If it returns a false, then the submitting of the form is blocked. Age. My text box. The value I put as PHP echo age. So in other words, if there's something on the query string for it, if I do a calculation, let's say, it repopulates them when I submit. If I didn't have that little snippet of code in, little snippet here, then it would display the input box a second time, but it wouldn't be populated with the old value. So this is a good thing to do because you want the user to see what they entered in. Oh, I entered in 21. I meant it to be 12. Okay, now I'm in the range. We have our submit button. We have our span for errors. I have something in here that says if is set, button submit. That is looking to see if there is the button submit on the query string, which will be set the second time around. In other words, when I want to do a calculation. If it's set, then I want to validate the form in PHP, and if valid, display the output. And that's the same code that we had before. It will display the output, and we're in business. To validate the form, here's the validate or display the output. Now, to show you how the PHP validation works, let's pretend let's not do the validation. Let's not do the client-side validation, just for fun. Yeah, I know that it's not very fun, but we'll say it's for fun. Let's save it. Now, if I don't enter something in here, I get the validation from the server side. And it doesn't try to calculate if it's in the range or not because it's invalid. As I said before, you will have redundant validation. On the client side, you validate what you can. That's sort of like just very simplistic, basic things like does a field have a value? Is a field numeric if it's supposed to be numeric? Is the field within a reasonable range? On the server side, you should do that validation and possibly more. The example I gave is with a credit card number. You can validate in the client if you've entered something for the credit card. On the server, you can repeat that validation, but you can also look to see if that is a valid credit card by looking at the bank that issued it and calling some API code to figure out is that a valid credit card or not. Okay, to show how reusable this code is, I'm going to attempt to make a new page. And this is what the page is going to do. I'll sketch it out. Because we've done all the work. We've done all the calculations. I don't even need to know how you calculate the heart range. I just need to know the functions to call. So I'm going to create a page that has a text box for age, a submit button, and when you type in the age, it will show you the range. All right, let's see if I can do this in 17 minutes or less. And we'll see how the do not repeat yourself really helps us out here. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to copy calculator post back. And I'm just going to call it age. I'm going to go into my nav include file. And I'm going to add age to the navigation. So it's going to get added to every page, a link to it. Call this calculate range for age. I did something wrong there. All right. Open up age. All right, I need this, I need this. Validate form, I'm keeping the same. There's no longer going to be TXT beats because I'm just going to be entering in a range. I'm going to have this call itself back, so I'm going to call age. And I want to have on my on submit. Still going to want to call the validate form function. All right, I do not want this. I don't want to enter the beats. I just want to enter the age. Now, validate form and display output is going to be different for this. So I'm going to create my own include file for this called age instead of check range. All righty. Go and edit this. We are only going to grab the age because that's all that's on this form. We're not going to check for the beats. And we're not going to check for the beats. Again, this is distinct to this page, so I don't worry about being reusable. So what am I going to call? I'm going to call the low and the high function. Let's remind us what those functions are called. Calculate minimum rate, calculate maximum rate. Calc min rate, X rate, calc max X rate. So I can say here, min equals calc min X rate, pass it the age. Max equals calculate max X range. And I can output it. Concatenating these fields together. So optimum is the minimum through the maximum. BPM. And if I'm not mistaken, that's it in 7 minutes, I think. Let's test it. Kind of calculate range for age. Click that in. The header is wrong, but I'll type in 55 years old. Optimum range is 82.5 to 132 beats per minute. Notice we didn't write any new date or heartbeat calculations. All right. Because all that was already in there. We already had the functions to do that. We just assembled what we're going to call. We assembled sort of the boss functions it's going to call. That's going to be called. Being a bit of a perfectionist. That's the power of writing good functions. And that's why in your assignment, it's not just getting the right answer. That's how it is in actual development too. If all you do is get the right answer, your program is functional, that's not particularly good. It needs to be written in a way that, number one, is fault tolerant. So if there's an error, it catches it. And number two, that it can be easily maintained. Let's say that the American Medical Association comes up with different guidelines. All I have to do is change this calculation. Let's say, in fact, I've even seen other calculations, but if I want to change it, maybe I'll change that to 0.6 or 0.7 over here. I can change it and be all set. Just change it in one place and all my pages are, the change is reflected in all my pages. So don't just aim for getting the right answer, aim for writing a maintainable code. What do we mean by maintainable? It means do not repeat yourself. Write good functions following all the guidelines that I laid out earlier. Small functions, functions that do one thing, functions that are self-contained. Only communicate with the outside world through arguments and return values. Are there any questions? If not, that's all I had for today. We'll either see you in lab or see you next week. Take care.